Greetings, everyone. Here are the main points of the video. The blueprint of the three wars. Why do strategists insist that the Russia-Ukraine conflict must go through exactly 3 stages before it can be resolved? Why was the Battle of Donbass in 2014 essentially just a step to set up the battlefield? The trap of freezing the conflict. Discover why a temporary ceasefire is a nightmare that strips both sides of their ultimate survival weapons. Why are they exhausting themselves to gain advantages before the crucial moment? How will the race in the shadows modernize the military and build a wall of deterrence? How is Moscow restructuring the war economy and preparing for a mass mobilization of the younger generation? The ticking time bomb of demographics, an invisible common enemy, is quietly devastating both nations, forcing them to launch a third war before there are no people left to take up arms. What is the basis for this from NATO intelligence? NATO has made a frightening prediction that Russia will directly test NATO's collective defense limits within the next 1 to 3 years. Welcome to the Luan Banqian Su's analysis program. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you, dear audience. Putin's administration fears depletion as they hurry to acquire superweapons, preparing for the next major conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, as this analysis is being delivered, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has officially lasted longer than the entire duration of World War I. This is not simply a border skirmish, but a seismic event that shakes the very foundations of the security order of the entire European continent. Strategists and military observers on both sides are acknowledging a harsh reality that is gradually becoming clear. Any ceasefire agreement or nominal peace treaty in the future will never be the end. It's just a temporary pause, a brief moment before the next storm arrives. To completely resolve this blood feud, Russia and Ukraine must go through 3 large-scale wars, and the current fierce confrontation is only the second chapter. Some experts believe that the third war, the final one, will lead to the complete collapse of one of the 2 countries, while others worry it could be the spark that ignites World War III. But no matter which scenario occurs, a future conflict is inevitable. When the guns of this second war fall silent, even temporarily, the countdown to the third war will immediately begin. To understand why observers are making such a dramatic and specific prediction, we need to look at the telling numbers from the humanitarian catastrophe of the current war. According to data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CIS, the conflict has left more than 2 million people on both sides dead or wounded. Even more alarming are reports from the world's leading independent and reputable monitoring organizations, Mediasona and the BBC, have directly confirmed that more than 230,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. This horrifying death toll is more than double the total number of American soldiers killed in all the wars the superpower has participated in since World War II combined. And that's only the deaths with clearly verified identities, while the actual number of casualties is certainly much higher. For a war in which the very future and survival of all of Europe is at stake, it is only natural that everyone hopes that when the smoke clears, true peace will be established. People expect that the 2 nations will focus on reconstruction, healing emotional wounds, and that families who have lost loved ones will have enough space to remember those who have fallen. However, reality is far crueler than any humane hope. The difference in strategic thinking between Moscow and Kyiv regarding a post-war order has made the prospect of peace seem distant. The essence of the 8-year-long Donbass war is a game of strategic positioning and accumulating conditions. Russia has patiently turned eastern Ukraine into a massive military springboard, building a logistics network and solid infrastructure to prepare for a larger-scale campaign. At the same time, Moscow always maintained a pressure tactic by threatening to recognize the independence of the 2 separatist regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, a move that was only realized a few days before the general offensive was announced. On the other hand, Ukraine also made the most of this valuable time to build solid defensive lines, prepare emergency response plans, and strive to strengthen diplomatic and military ties with Western powers as much as possible. However, the Donbass war ended without either side achieving their ultimate goals. Russia was unable to control the entire Donbass region or force the international community to recognize its sovereignty over Crimea, while Ukraine was also powerless to completely push back Russia's influence from its territory. Both Moscow and Kyiv deeply understood that this deadlocked status quo was just a spark waiting to ignite into a larger conflagration. Therefore, both sides spent a full 8 years meticulously preparing for an inevitable confrontation. In the end, Moscow was quicker in completing the preparations for a full-scale attack before Kyiv could establish a strong enough deterrent to prevent that scenario from happening. Russia entered the Second War under relatively favorable conditions for itself, proactively setting an ambitious war agenda to occupy Kyiv and eliminate Ukraine's independent sovereignty. Facing a precarious situation, Ukraine was forced to shift all its strategic objectives to the ultimate mission of survival, thwarting Moscow's ambitions and protecting the nation's existence. The Second War is unfolding with unprecedented brutality, but it is precisely in today's ruins and sacrifices that the seeds and conditions for the Third War, the war that will determine the fate of both nations, are quietly taking shape. So why do both Russia and Ukraine believe that restarting the war is the only option that serves their interests? Or worse, why do they believe the other side is so determined to spark a conflict that it becomes inevitable? From Moscow's perspective, war is no longer just a temporary solution, but has become a lifeline for survival. To keep the country running, Russia has shifted the entire system to a war economy model, where armed conflict and the accompanying economic drivers act as vital stimulants for survival. The Kremlin leadership cannot accept giving up their military objectives, and even less can they allow the world to strip them of their claim to sovereignty over the Zamir Peninsula and the territories in eastern Ukraine. Moscow has already poured enormous resources into these occupied territories, and they cannot accept allowing Ukraine time to recover, rebuild its military, and reclaim its territory at a time favorable to Kyiv. As Russia's global position is rapidly declining and its economy is beginning to fracture, a decisive victory in Ukraine is seen as the last lifeline to reverse the situation, taking advantage of Ukraine's economic potential to breathe new life into itself. Moscow has eliminated all escape routes, peace, and stability, binding its fate tightly to this vortex of war. On the opposite side of the front line, Ukraine has just gone through a harsh life-and-death ordeal. Even after enduring 4 years of devastation, Kyiv's future prospects are now brighter than any previous dark predictions. A great journey of reconstruction awaits this country, along with unprecedented economic opportunities thanks to the path toward joining the European Union and the rise of an advanced, self-reliant defense industry. Ukraine is forging unprecedented security ties with Western partners, establishing a clear blueprint to modernize and strengthen its peacetime military forces. This country is rapidly transforming to become more transparent and developed, leaving its Soviet past behind to join the European mainstream on a path that surpasses Russia. However, the tragedy lies in the fact that even if Ukraine achieves certain successes in its counteroffensives, before this war comes to a temporary halt, the complete restoration of the 2014 borders remains a distant goal. This means that no matter how much Ukraine's position and strength advance, a part of their sacred territory will still be under Russian control. This is a painful sore, a fundamental conflict that Kyiv can never compromise on. Therefore, a ceasefire agreement to freeze the conflict along the current front line, even though it is the most likely scenario to end the Second War, will never be able to satisfy both sides. That is why, for a long time, both sides have quietly adjusted their combat objectives to accumulate as much tactical and strategic advantage as possible before the guns fall silent. Because when the ceasefire takes effect, whether it lasts for a day or for decades, it will immediately take away the most powerful tools of both countries. During nominal peace, both sides are prohibited from attacking or destroying each other's infrastructure or using force to gain territory, except for covert intelligence operations. No government can continue to force millions of people to sacrifice their lives or compel the entire economy to serve brutal war objectives. Every step after the ceasefire, including Ukraine joining NATO or Russia trying to restore its military strength to pre-war levels, is ultimately just a minor adjustment on the sidelines, far from the sweeping, comprehensive restructuring that can only be achieved under the flames of total war. This illusion has already been exposed by previous failed negotiations. Russia's determination not to end the war until it controls the Donbass region, especially Ukraine's fortified defensive ring in Donetsk, is by no means a coincidence. It is well understood that these fortified cities are the strongest barriers and the foundation for an inviolable Ukrainian border in the future if they manage to regain the initiative. Ukraine also fully understands this reasoning And that's why they firmly reject any peace terms that require them to concede parts of the Donbass that Russia has not yet captured. Russia wants to impose an agreement that disarms Ukraine and prevents the country from joining NATO. Because if they can't use military force to compel Ukraine to surrender now, Russia will never have the chance to do so at the peace negotiation table. Clearly, Ukraine understands that any concession is not a remedy to prevent war, but rather an act of self-destruction, weakening itself before the next confrontation, which they see as an inevitable fate. When two countries not only prepare for war, but also firmly believe that the other side is doing the same, a new conflict is bound to erupt sooner or later, like a self-fulfilling prophecy. In democratic systems, leaders who prove their strategic ability and toughness will be chosen by history, while those who are weak will be eliminated. And in authoritarian regimes, where war is the highest priority or even the very reason for the economy's existence, all state resources will be exhausted to serve military objectives, regardless of the suffering of the people or the exhaustion of the country. An entire culture, national identity, and the spirit of social unity will now be shaped around the obsession with a future holy war, where the only language spoken is the language of battle and gunpowder. What does NATO intelligence predict? According to multiple intelligence reports from NATO member governments, the alliance predicts that Russia will directly challenge NATO within just a few years if they gain strategic advantages in Ukraine. Within a short time frame of 1 to 3 years, Moscow is expected to launch a limited attack, not aimed at occupying large territories, but mainly to test the limits of Article 5 on collective defense of the NATO alliance. In the long term, European intelligence agencies believe that a full-scale war is inevitable, as it is the only way to maintain the existence of a Russian state that has already been distorted and cannot survive without the specter of war. However, the scenario in which Russia carries out a swift and limited attack while Ukraine is left behind, weakened, sidelined from NATO, and no longer plays any role in the European defense system will never happen. On the contrary, Ukraine is proudly demonstrating its role as a shield protecting the entire continent. Meanwhile, European leaders also have to admit that after this war, the real combat capability of the Ukrainian army will surpass that of any other European country. This geopolitical shift has inadvertently strengthened the unwavering belief of Alessandro Dugin, Dmitry Medvedev, and the power brokers in the Kremlin as they prepare for the final showdown with the West. They are determined to crush Ukraine first. The prophecy shapes policy, and in turn, the policy fuels the prophecy even further. If a ceasefire agreement is signed, both countries will immediately enter a desperate race against time to solve vital issues before returning to the battlefield. And one thing is certain, unlike the rapid transition from the Donbass War to the full-scale offensive in 2022, this time both sides truly need a long pause to tend to their wounds before entering the final decisive battle. Whether this ceasefire pause lasts for several months, several years, or even decades, it is certainly not a time of peace, but rather a breathless sprint to prepare for the next decisive battle. For Kyiv, this is a golden opportunity to comprehensively and rapidly modernize its military. They will make the most of foreign investment to revive their fledgling defense industry, while also receiving the most advanced and complex military equipment from the West that they cannot yet produce domestically. At the same time, Ukraine will urgently reinforce solid defensive belts behind the main front lines and along the left bank of the Dnipro River to block any future Russian offensives. Building on the resounding successes of its medium and long-range airstrike campaigns, Kyiv will certainly maximize its deep strike capabilities. At the same time, they will urgently seek strong and swift security commitments from global military allies. This could be realized by joining the NATO alliance or through the deployment of a coalition of willing and capable countries on the ground. Kyiv's ultimate goal is to build a strong wall of deterrence in case Russia dares to attack Ukraine again. They must face the full might of major powers and strategic allies head-on. On the other side of the front line, the Kremlin will also launch a silent but equally fierce general mobilization. The top priority of the Kremlin is to rest its troops and replenish its forces, and train soldiers without letting them be discharged and return to civilian life. They will lay the groundwork for larger-scale military mobilizations in the future, especially targeting the youth in wealthy urban areas where the authorities previously tried to avoid conscription to maintain social stability. Economically and industrially, Russia is forced to find every way to rebuild its high-tech sectors, restore oil refining infrastructure, and revive energy exports, those economic lifelines that have been crippled by Ukraine's attacks. Moscow will also use its production capacity to manufacture a massive amount of cheap ammunition to create an overwhelming firepower advantage, ready to bombard Ukraine's fortified positions with unprecedented barrages of shells if the conflict flares up again. However, both countries are facing a common, invisible, but extremely ruthless enemy, a severe demographic crisis. Even before the full-scale offensive broke out, Ukraine had been struggling with serious population aging and a shortage of young workers, to the point that the average age in their military is much higher than most fighting forces around the world. Meanwhile, Russia, despite having a significantly larger population, is also falling into a similar demographic trap. Moscow has already sacrificed too large a proportion of its young adult generation in the trenches, while those who remain are either highly skilled at avoiding conscription or belong to the wealthy elite in major cities, people who always believe they are safe from mandatory mobilization orders. This demographic tragedy has inadvertently become a driving force, pushing both sides to act quickly, prepare rapidly, and resolve the next conflict before the ticking population time bomb completely explodes. It also forces both Moscow and Kyiv to seek out and rely on external military alliances, and even on soldiers from other countries. This diplomatic battle is clearly favoring Ukraine. Kyiv has a great opportunity to establish a mutual defense alliance on the ground in the near future. On the other hand, for Russia, a power with expansionist ambitions, finding allies will be much more difficult. Because persuading partners to join a joint defense alliance is always much easier than dragging them into an open and illegal war of aggression. The allies on both sides, the West, including Europe and North America, backing Ukraine, and the bloc of China, North Korea, Belarus, and other countries supporting Russia, absolutely do not want a permanent peace. So, in your opinion, if a ceasefire agreement is signed in the near future, how long do you think it could last before a third major war breaks out?